Hello, good afternoon everyone. We are Solar Storm Prediction team. I am Dattaraj, this is my team, Sean and Anna Maria, and we are going to take you through the development of solar flare advanced warning system. So, when all of us look at sunrises and sunsets, they look very beautiful. But for a solar physicist like me, what is even more beautiful and stimulating is the magnetic field of the sun. So this magnetic field is produced deep inside, the magnetic field is produced deep inside the surface of the sun, and it is carried to the surface by the plasma motion, and at the surface, this magnetic field expands into the atmosphere in gigantic loops. These loops have a lot of magnetic free energy, and this free energy is released when there is an eruption, and these eruptions are solar flares. So we experience solar flares as short wavelength electromagnetic radiation, like X-rays. This radiation ionizes the atmosphere of the sun, and this affects our GPS communication satellites, and the radiation itself is harmful to aviation crew. Moreover, we experience solar flares as soon as we see them. They travel at very fast speed of light. So we don't have any warning. And that is why it is important to forecast these flares, at least 1 hour warning. Okay. So how do we currently forecast solar flares? How does NOAA currently forecast solar flares? We have known since long that active regions, magnetic active regions on the sun are connected to the flares. And looking at the complexity of these active regions and given our past observations, we have a model, and that model gives us persistence. That is, if the sun is quiet now, we can tell with some confidence that it is going to be quiet for some time. If it is flaring now, then we can tell with some confidence that it is going to be flaring for a while. But what we cannot predict is a change of state. So our goal is to come up with a solar flare forecasting model that is capable of warning stakeholders like communication industry, aviation industry, at least an hour in advance, with focus of beating this persistence model. And to do that, what we need is data. And this data comes from solar mission satellites, and we need to convert it into useful data, and we need a software process that will analyze this data and come up with prediction. And ideally, the prediction that will beat persistence. And after getting the results, we need tools to analyze our model that will give us insight into the flare mechanism and perhaps new physics. Okay. Coming to data, NASA launched Solar Dynamic Observatory in 2010 with focus on solar activity, and this solar mission takes images of the sun, images of the magnetic field every 12 minutes, images of the solar atmosphere every 2 seconds. So we have terabytes and terabytes of data every day. We use images of solar atmosphere because flare activity is taking place in the solar atmosphere. So the images of the solar atmosphere come in 8 channels. So these different channels highlight different layers of the solar atmosphere. From left to right, hotter and higher layers of solar atmosphere. And we use these images and feed it in our model, and what we get out is X-ray flux 1 hour ahead. And looking at X-ray flux, we can tell the solar flares. I want you to remember this plot because it is going to appear again. But I told you that we have lots of data, but it comes with its own challenges. Of course, we have to correct for instrument issues like sensitivity, which degrades over the years. But our major problem, our major challenge is glass imbalance. We don't have as many high magnitude X-ray flux events as we have, background X-ray flux events. So how do we tackle it? We oversample. We collect flare examples for high magnitude over the last 7 years, about 2,000 to 3,000 of them. Then we flip and rotate these images and prepare our data set to tackle glass imbalance. Unique to this particular data set is the problem of high dynamic range. The pixel magnitudes of these images can vary from 0 to about hundreds of thousands. And to counter that, we need to take log transformation and more. And Anna Maria will take it through.
Thank you. And as Dataraj was mentioning, in this project we had to deal with massive amounts of data. And imagine all these images from the sun that come with lots of data behind each of the image, and each of the image is taken every 2 minutes on 8 channels. And in order to extract some meaningful features for our data processing, we also had to do pre-processing of the data. The pre-processing of the data involves logarithmic transformation. As you can see on the left side of this slide, the distribution of the image data is very long-tailed. So in order to extract those meaningful features, we do logarithmic transformation. And the logarithmic transformation of the images look like this, and you can already see how some features from the sun are already highlighted, and they come out better from the background. And after a logarithmic transformation, we also use principal component analysis, through which you can already see how we can detect even better some features from the sun. And in the very first image, we were able to capture 87% of the variance in the data, while using the first three principal components, we were able to capture 97% of the information from the data. Now this was about data pre-processing. Now let's move on towards building the scientific process. And in the scientific process, we dealt with the analysis of magnetic complexity, looking at the magnetic field of the sun, and then with deep learning. When it comes to magnetic complexity, we started with some previous work that has been done on the fractal sun. As you can probably recognize this picture, this is a very famous fractal. It's the Mandelbrot set. And you probably know of other fractals in nature, such as snowflakes, or riverbeds, or shorelines. And heliophysicists showed that even the sun displays this general law of nature, which is called self-similarity. It happens in our data set as well, and it happens both for the X-ray flux and for the images of the sun. Why is this important? It is because in this way, we can actually focus on generating network-based models, and particularly on scale-free network-based models. Think internet. Internet is such an example of a scale-free network, where we take a magnetogram from the sun, and we are looking at local extremes, local minima and local maxima, and we take these mountains and valleys in the data, and we take just the highest mountains and the deepest valleys, and we replot them on the magnetogram, and we construct a different kind of network. We construct a mathematical network or a graph, where for each of these points of local minima and local maxima, we reconnect them, and we achieve something like this. So we have a network of the most influential points, or the most extreme points in the sun, and now we can do some network transformations, and particularly network centrality transformation. In this case, it's eigenvalue centrality, where we are basically reducing the topology of the network. And when we replot this eigenvalue centrality on the magnetograms, let's say on a sequence of 5 magnetograms at 4 hours, 2 hours before a flare, at the time of the flare, 2 hours after the flare, and 4 hours after the flare, we can actually track the movement of these nodes. And these nodes, basically, you can think of them as being nodes of influence in the network, of relative influence. So at 4 hours before, 2 hours before the flare, at the time of the flare, at 2 hours after the flare, and 4 hours after the flare, and you can see that they tend to cluster. And in this way, we can actually track the movement of these nodes of influence. And if we are looking at the flares versus non-flares, can somebody tell me, for instance, when this plot, where are the flares in these, let's say, statistical box plots? Well, you probably guessed they are the red ones, right? So in this way, so using this kind of network centrality, we are able to separate the flares from the non-flares in a meaningful way, which means that we know that there is very good information over there, and we can bring deep learning into the picture.
So I'm here to explain a bit more about the how we use all these insights to generate our forecasts. And I'm glad that James said that this problem is not really like cat pictures, because naturally the first picture in my explanation will involve a cat. So we're going to be applying techniques of computer vision to predict flares, and in computer vision you basically treat the image as a matrix of numbers, so the computer is seeing that field of numbers there, and as a result of processing it in this image classification problem, will label it as it's 82% certain that it's a cat, 15% dog, 2% hat, 1% mug. So it largely did pretty well there, but in our case we're going to be processing images of the sun, and from that we are going to be generating an X-ray flux prediction, so it's more of a regression task than a classification task. So how do we go about processing these images of the sun? You've seen it a few times mentioned, a convolutional neural network. You can think of that as passing these filters over the image stepwise and taking linear combinations of the sun repeatedly. You layer those on top of each other, as you're seeing from left to right here. The first convolutional layer, the filter you pass over it, is going to extract things like edges. So this is an example from a paper on processing faces. So you first get the edges, and then you compose all those together, and you start getting structures like noses and eyes, and then when you get farther along the network, you start getting whole structures like faces, or whole objects of what you're looking for. So this is a fairly simplistic network in the derived from some of the experiences in the image classification community. You have a series of these convolutional filters that hopefully can produce that layered structure where it gets increasingly complex. So let's see how we're going to do in our persistence task, or beating persistence as a predictor of solar flare activity. We faced many challenges in the course of getting here, and we'll say that at 10:31 p.m. last night, Dalraj sent along the on Slack the message of, oh, here's the prediction on time series between May and June 2014 in a comparison with NOAA, which is the body that's tasked with doing a lot of forecasting from the US government. And so unpack this a little bit. This is the 24-hour maximum X-ray flux forecast, where it's forecasted every 12 hours. So it's kind of the maximum that we would expect a flare to output. And you can see the green line is NOAA's forecast. The blue line is the true output, and the red line, populating largely the middle of those two, is our prediction as output by our fairly vanilla neural network. But from this, though, we're not really satisfied with just saying that we have a decent line in the middle there. We need to be able to explain why and what that actually means and what it's actually trying to do. And this is where we go to our target breakthrough of science and be able to visualize the results, and then maybe discover from that flare precursors, or provide new physical insights, and maybe derive some form of new physics from this. The first visualization we can bring to it is one of saliency, or we ask the network what the most salient or important part of the image is. So if you look at this monkey, the area of light largely corresponds to where the monkey is in the picture. So you can say that the network is paying attention to the monkeys and is important for making the classification of monkey. So what does this look like for our solar images? So we have a false color image on the left that incorporates a lot of the different channels that are present. And on the right, you can see one of our early results on a saliency map, and you can see that it's actually tracing a lot of the active regions that are the areas most likely to produce solar flares and the X-ray flux associated with them. So that's great. It looks like it's learning something. We can also go and try and, like those base visualizations that show the structures that are present in faces that are composed into a whole face at the end of the network. We can do a similar thing with our flare net and see that in the second of the blocks of convolutional filters we have captured some semblance of texture. Beneath that though, when you start composing a lot of those texture filters together, you're starting to see structure in the form of what actually looks like active regions. So that's very exciting. We may be successfully capturing the relationships of present in the sun. This is really the payoff for me in terms of developing something. Andre is one of our mentors on the project. He was very happy to see these visualizations, and just in terms of developing software and having it be used, eventually driving science, this was really a great moment for me that led to tears of joy there. So in terms of achievements, to summarize, we've reduced the dimensionality of these higher dimensional images that's sampled from different layers of the sun. We have a topological model of the solar magnetic field that we have plans on incorporating towards future forecasts. We've trained the network, and we have a flare forecasting tool. And in that tool, we have a open source repository. It's currently public, but don't try and play with it yet. We have a lot of cleaning up to do. It's been a real rapid development, few weeks. But there you go. And at this point, we'd like to acknowledge and thank our sponsors who are pictured on the bottom, and fill in for me if I forget anyone here. But we were running on IBM's hardware on a whole lot of GPUs. And we had the benefit as well of working in the SETI Institute for the whole summer, and working as well with a few people from these organizations, including the ones pictured on both sides here, Troy, who can wave if he's right there, and he's from IBM, and Andres from, I think it was at the Southwest Research Institute. Hope I got that right. We also got a lot of input and help from Mark, who is somewhere around. There he is, thank you. And Monica as well, who's sitting with the paleophysicist over there. So I think that about covers it, so we're on to questions.
All right, big round of applause. I don't know who's got the tough job of telling Noah about this, but amazing, and congratulations on your results. Let's put it to our reviewers. I don't know, we have a lot of expertise here, and Ian, do you want to kick off?
I was surprised you found one principal component that explains 97% of the data. Did that principal component also end up being really relevant to the prediction that you make at the end? Or does the prediction come from the other less commonly changing components?
Actually, we have not used the principal component images for our training. So we were doing a lot of things all these weeks. We were not getting the results, but we were analyzing the data. this was part of data analysis, and we plan to take it out from here and use all these things which we have analyzed.
And to add to that, you could view the first layer of the neural network as attempting to do a similar process to it, and we wanted to know what the actual dimensionality that the network was dealing with when it's passed in, because we were going with 8, 16, 32 dimensions, since we were actually layering additional images on for different experiments as well. So it was part of the exploratory analysis and towards future networks as well.
Sangram, have you got any thoughts?
Yeah, so great study, it's a great application, and a couple of questions I have in mind is, so the CNN architecture that you worked on, the two things that come to my mind. One is, I saw that in the initial input node space, you have 1024 times 1024 times 8 channels, which feeds in. Now, did you do a test where you could actually, because I always play with these things, and when you break it down to patches, and when you actually stride the patches, what is the optimal patch size which gives you the highest possible accuracy? So it basically means that you could play with the different architectures of the model. And this becomes critical because it depends on what you're trying to achieve. Are you trying to, at the end of it, do a semantic segmentation of those hotspots, or you're just trying to identify the objects? And the other question I had in mind is one of the prediction time series results that you showed. What was the algorithm that you used in that? Was it like an LSTM kind of a recurrent neural net, or what was that about?
Okay, so there's a couple of questions there that you might have to remind me a little bit to
Sure.
get back to it. In terms of optimality and what structure of the neural network to use, I'd say that we can't quite get there. We incorporated a Bayesian search algorithm for looking over the network architectures. However, we didn't have quite enough time to go through that, particularly because getting all the data into place took a decent amount of time doing the necessary pre-processing. So we'd like to spend a lot more compute time on that to answer that question, and we've defined a lot of software necessary towards being able to do that and getting it to run faster. We would also like to increase the batch size substantially. Our images are a lot larger than ImageNet competition images, which is the kind of standard benchmark for these things. And ideally, if we were to have much larger benchmarks, then we would be able to deal with a lot of the noise that's present in solar images, because there's a lot of pixels that are each emitting something, and each of those can be important in one way or another, and that can confuse the gradient a little bit if you don't have the batch size set high enough.
So just one question was that, okay, if you're looking at the hotspots, what kind of image metrics you're talking about? What's the dimension usually you're looking at when you're looking at the sun? Is it like a 50 by 50 pixels where the hotspots, or it's much bigger than that?
Sorry, can I have the question again?
So when I'm looking at the RGB composite of the sun, right, which you showed here, and I could see some hotspots there, what is the standard image size I'm looking at, just covering the hotspot?
You mean the active regions?
Yes,
It
exactly,
is
yes.
about 60 pixels.
Okay, makes sense.
Neil?
So if I understand right, you were looking ahead 1 hour in your predictions? Yeah, and so you're a little biased there in the NOAA predictions. They're doing a 12-hour look ahead. So you have some time to go. But also, there have been some previous studies that have shown that there's been some relative brightenings in the active regions an hour or two ahead of time. Did you look at any comparisons of those studies? Is that what your algorithm's finding, is changes in relative brightness?
So in our case, just in terms of number of possible experiments we could run, I think ideally we would be able to stage in all the petabytes of data and look at all different timescales and such, but we just didn't have time for it this summer, but hoping to go forward to be able to look at each of those questions.
Okay.
This is quite impressive given that I was with some of you till 6:37 p.m. last night. You know, even if you didn't achieve this breakthrough, I thought that this was a very important exercise to go through to really take a science problem, and this is not an ordinary science problem. It is a magnetically driven system that you have been able to produce this itself. Kind of, I don't know, I'm amazed. I'm a scientist. Or perhaps a science manager, but not an AI specialist. But that's pretty fascinating. Some of the challenges, I'd like to hear more about that you talked about. You know, you're kind of using data set so large and having to reduce them to kind of do your analysis, and also the computer resources. So if you want to kind of follow this through, right, in future, what should we be asking for and looking at in terms of requirements, especially computational?
Okay. So the ideal thing going into the future, especially if we're talking about FDL programs in general, since it's such an accelerated course, would be to start with the data in place that we can really concentrate on generating saliency maps and other things to try and drive towards informed search of different architectures. There's a whole lot of things that we didn't get an opportunity to try because for time that if the data were in place, we could concentrate on that. Like we didn't do much customization to the convolutional filters towards magnetic properties that we have to work off of the baseline of what's usually done for ImageNet competitions or image classification. And I think there's a lot of room in physics for defining what the learnable filters are, what those red boxes are for physics that pass over the image. And I think that we can also incorporate a lot more expert information into it than we were able to at this point. You've seen an earlier presentation where we were talking about side channel information, which is part of the software architecture where you can bring in the human expert information and then let the computer concentrate on learning the things we don't know about. So I'd like to run a lot more experiments around that.
Great. Jinal, did you have any closing thoughts? It sounds like it's on. Give it a tap.
Yeah. Well, in fact, Ian asked me one of the questions that I was going to ask. So, you know, I have a question regarding if you guys have any plans on using other models than deep learning.
Yeah, we actually use the most well-known statistical models that are usually used in time series forecasting, such as ARIMA models, random walk models, Holt-Winters, exponential smoothing. They do moving average as well. They do fairly well in predicting the baseline, but they totally miss the flares. And they miss the flares, and they also sometimes detect flares where they are not. So yeah, we do have actually an analysis with mean squared errors for all these models.
Thank you. Excellent. Oh, Pete.
Yeah, one of the things that, you know, I mean, this is very impressive. That, of course, a lot of interest is, you know, and I guess we'll talk about it soon, but the impact on the Earth. So coupling this with some of the interplanetary predictions, is that something you're going to be trying to do?
Well, I swear you're setting up for a segue to the next team.
Well, yes, but I mean, so I mean, I think that's what I'm, you know, is it?
So I'd say that their task is made much easier for forecasting the terrestrial interactions if we're able to give them a good report of what the sun's going to be sending our way.
So you're working with them?
In theory, I mean,
It was a shame that it was 10:31 last night.
Yeah. So I don't think they've had a chance to check in our code yet. And
This looks like really good input.
yeah. But agreed.
All right, thanks everyone. Let's give them a round of applause. Can we please have the solar test interactions team come up, please?